Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Jamie Rhome. He's the Deputy Director of the National Hurricane Center, commonly called the NHC. He plays a crucial role in developing the long-term strategies as well as coordinating the organization's planning and day-to-day operations. The NHC is essential in keeping us safe during hurricane season, which starts in June and lasts through November. It's responsible for tracking and predicting tropical weather systems in the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific Oceans. From issuing advisories and warnings to providing critical information for emergency planning, the NHC is at the forefront of hurricane preparedness and response. Jamie and the entire NHC team work tirelessly to ensure that we have the information we need to stay safe when a storm is on the horizon. So, if you're a weather enthusiast, a disaster preparedness professional, or simply someone interested in learning more about hurricane safety, this episode is for you. So join me as Jamie unlocks the mysteries of tropical cyclones. This is Kevin Peterson. Welcome to Weather Heroes. Jamie, thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me.
Jamie, tell us a little bit about your background. What gets someone involved in working at the National Hurricane Center?
Sometimes it's a non-linear path. For me, I grew up in North Carolina, and originally I got interested in weather very young, and that's common of meteorologists to sort of get the bug early in life. But it started with me with winter weather. North Carolina is a place where you get this rain, snow, ice line sort of set up that can be really hard to predict. So that's how I got started. And then a couple of high-profile hurricanes in my late teens acting through North Carolina switched me over to being interested in hurricanes. And specifically, I was noticing just a huge disruption in people's lives, a huge cost for society, not just in mortality or loss of life, but in economics. And started thinking about what I could do, make these storms less impactful to society.
So did you go to meteorology school? Where was your training and your education?
Yeah, North Carolina State University. And so both my undergraduate and graduate degrees were at North Carolina State University. And it's interesting, their motto at NC State is a very simple motto. It's called think and do. And so, a lot of how I sort of attack problems in government is very much that way. I'm not huge into long, drawn-out processes that span years and years and years, and all this process and teams and all that sort of stuff. I'm very much a sort of roll your sleeves up and get to work. And the Hurricane Center is very much a perfect fit for that sort of approach, because the scale or the time that we operate doesn't lend itself to deliberation. The problems that we encounter, they require immediate solutions, whether it be in a storm, that's on the scale of minutes to hours, or improvements in the off season, that's on the scale of weeks to months. So, to work at the Hurricane Center, you really have to have this sort of get it done sort of approach. It's a very fast-paced environment.
So obviously we all know that the National Hurricane Center is tracking hurricanes, tracking tropical storms, i.e. tropical cyclones. How would you sum up the ultimate role or the ultimate goal of the National Hurricane Center?
Oh, it's for public safety. Now, so these systems, even the seedling systems, tropical waves or disturbances or tropical depressions, can be incredibly disruptive. And to explain that, one of the biggest and most impactful weather events in the Caribbean are heavy rains and flash flooding. You don't need a Category 5 to produce those heavy rains. In fact, some of their most impactful flooding occurs from just ordinary disturbances, systems that aren't named, systems that the mainstream media is not tracking. So, we're doing it for public safety for that purpose. And then the other part of our mission that a lot of people don't understand or appreciate is what we call safety of life at sea. If you've ever gone on a cruise ship or ordered goods that are transported here on a large tanker, those large ships have to traverse the ocean safely. At least that's the goal. And we're providing them weather support and surveillance of weather phenomenon, every day of the year, not just hurricane season. And then some of those services, some of those systems develop and become powerful hurricanes. And that's the part of our mission that people are more commonly understand or see. Obviously, we're doing that part for public safety, protection of life and property.
Obviously, there's not just the National Hurricane Center because you guys don't go global, but what areas, or I guess what geography does the National Hurricane Center cover?
Yeah, it's actually a great question. And a lot of people don't know this is sort of hurricanes don't just occur here in our part of the world. They occur across the globe. And so the globe is sort of split up into areas of responsibilities. And that designation, that area of responsibility is codified under the United Nations, it's formal protocols, who does what, how we do it. So we have basically the Atlantic Ocean, the entire Atlantic Ocean from the coast of Africa all the way across the Caribbean Sea, Gulf of Mexico, so all of Central America, Latin America, the countries throughout the Caribbean. And then our area extends into the Eastern Pacific. So we cover cyclones that are, impacting the west coast of Mexico, the Baja Peninsula. And then sometimes those systems can make a run at the extreme southwestern United States, as we saw last year with Hillary.
There's also a Pacific Hurricane Center. Wouldn't they cover Hawaii?
Yeah, so the Central Pacific is covered by another NOAA office. Our parent organization is NOAA, the Central Pacific Hurricane Center. So a system that would impact Hawaii they would take over those responsibilities. Typically, those storms form in the Eastern Pacific, so our area. So we have a pass off or sort of a handshake. So we pass the storm from us to them. And then as you get into the Western Pacific, there is multiple agencies or governments that cover cyclones up there. Japan, meteorological services in Tokyo cover sort of the Northwest Pacific. And then as you drop down, you've got into the Southern Pacific, you've got Fiji and Australia covering, different parts of the basin depending on where you are. And then we all sort of follow global requirements or global protocols. But what's different about the Western Pacific versus the Eastern is they're called typhoons out there. We call them hurricanes, they're called typhoons out there. And then there's some slight variations, how they're rated and judged in the Western Pacific.
So you had mentioned, it doesn't take a Category 5, and obviously there is a rating scale, and we have also tropical storms, and you talked about the damage. I remember Tropical Storm Allison parking over Texas and talking about flooding. That was a classic example of not being a hurricane, but certainly being a long-term challenge. Talk to me about that rating scale and some of the perils involved.
Yeah, so it was originally designed to be a wind engineering scale to rate the amount of damage that could occur from wind. And when it was originally developed, so think decades ago, we didn't have internet and social media and the ability to send rich content, images. Communication systems were pretty primitive relative to today's standards. It was a very powerful and useful way of communicating the relative risk with a hurricane. Fast forward now, we have much, much better ways to break down the nuances of these storms. And so the Saffir-Simpson scale has sort of lost its value in terms of breaking out a hurricane on its hazards and risk. But because it's so institutionalized and so familiar, it's continued to be used, often misused because of its familiarity. And so people naturally assume that a Category 2 is worse than a 1, a 3 is worse than a 2, so on and so forth. In some aspects, that is true, but not all aspects. So rainfall, for example, often has little to nothing to do with the Saffir or the scale. Storm surge, while it does go up with the higher scale, there are other factors that are equally, if not more important than the wind speed, such as the size and forward speed of the storm. Tornado risk is often not necessarily a function of the scale. The scale has lost its ability to convey this nuance that comes with the hurricane. And we're trying to shift away from it more and more directly communicate the risk.
So, for example, as a hurricane is approaching, you're saying, well, this is a Cat 3, but this really is a rainmaker with potential flood, for example.
Correct. And so what a lot of people are doing, and we see this even with experienced, people who have experienced hurricanes, they will say, well, I experienced a Category 5, this one's only a Category 2, and they will make a totally wrong deduction. So there's so many ways that can go off the rails. For example, just because you were near a Category 5 doesn't mean you experienced Category 5 wind speeds. So a lot of people in South Florida, for example, who went through Hurricane Andrew, think they experienced a Category 5 hurricane. The Category 4 winds, were confined to a really narrow swath, extreme southern Dade County, in and around sort of the Homestead area. A lot of people in the western part of the county experienced probably tropical storm and Category 1 winds. And then in Broward County, the next county up, most certainly tropical storm force winds. So if one sort of says, every time we have a hurricane threat here in South Florida, oh, I went through a Category 5, you're going to naturally make the wrong conclusion. There's that. That's just the wind part. Then there's the whole storm surge part, which is, again, so many things driving storm surge other than wind. So Andrew, for example, we stick with Andrew, moved really fast, right? If you remember, like you experienced it, it was in and out in like 2 hours. It was a really quick storm. And that sort of limited the storm surge to, a very small impact zone. It didn't go very far inland, and it didn't impact a ton of people. A slow-moving Cat 2 could produce tremendously more storm surge and flooding here in South Florida. So that we got to get people to stop focusing solely on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Again, it's a wind engineering scale. It gives you some indication of the degree of wind damage, but it doesn't include all the other aspects of a hurricane.
As you're assessing strengths, and I know that forecasting direction is easier than forecasting strength or potential impact, and that's certainly, and I know y'all have made improvements, but certainly the potential impact cone. Tell me about some of those models and the forecasting you're doing there, and how that has really improved quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a great question, because I think the way people assume we forecast is based largely on what they see on the internet or television. A lot of people see and look at these so-called models. We don't necessarily look at the same models. Some of those models that people look at are quite bad, and we have techniques internally that take all those models in, and we see more than people. What you see on TV is like probably 10% of what we consume here. And we have AI techniques that basically will look at how those models have performed in the past and try to correct them, we call it a bias and a bias correction, and try to correct them and present the forecaster with some suggestions, like this model might be too far south or too fast or that sort of stuff. And then the forecasters, using their experience, are able to add even more value to the process. What I'm building up to is the guidance we have internally is superior to anything that people are looking at externally, right? What you see on TV is just not, great, but people like it. And, and some TV professionals promote it as useful information. But I bet you, if I could probably surprise you here, that our human generated forecast beat everything out there. And so people often text me or call me and say, hey, which model should I follow? Which model is the best? And it's the official forecast, because our humans and our internal techniques allow us to add a tremendous value over the raw models which people try to consume in their ordinary lives.
Those models, to your point, they're when you see the spaghetti model, for example, that are sometimes produced, you're like, well, okay, let me turn to the National Hurricane Center, and
it's virtually impossible. I mean, this might be a little bit upsetting to the weather enthusiasts out there, but it's virtually impossible for an untrained person to look at those models and deduce which one is more likely.
And that makes a lot of sense. And that's why we have you guys, the National Hurricane Center. Obviously, y'all are getting communications out to the public, tracking that's going on. And how do y'all do that? And obviously, as part of that, you name the storms so we can identify them and not be confused with other storms that might be out there. Tell me about that communication process, and where do warnings and watches come in?
Yeah, and this is the next frontier. This is probably where we're putting the most of our R&D, research and development efforts at present, is the communication of our products and services. Is probably where I spend the vast majority of my time, where the bulk of my passion is personally, because the greatest and most accurate forecast in the world is useless if it's not communicated effectively, and the recipient of that forecast interprets it correctly. So there's communication, and then you have to make sure the person you're communicating with receives and understands and acts on that information. The naming goes back a long, long time. So it's got a historical component we've obviously retained over the years. The biggest benefit in modern times, as you alluded to, is the ability to clearly, track a feature and have people follow and stay up to date on it. And at the peak of hurricane season, there could be 5 or 6 cyclones in the Atlantic. And if we didn't have a way for people to decipher which one is which and which one you're talking about, mass confusion could easily ensue. So the naming has a purpose for just helping people track, understand, and communicate the impacts that would come from that particular system. Our watches and warnings are probably our most, in my mind, important and useful bit of information that we produce. It's certainly the product that the forecasters spend the most time on. Let me say that again. Our watches and warnings are the part of the forecast that our human forecasters spend the most time on. They're really, really, really focused on getting those right. But for whatever reason, probably because people want to look at models and look at other distracting things, there's been a trend of late of people ignoring our watches and warnings. I think they go off and look at some information and make a forecast on their own, ignore the warnings. And I would say the last several really impactful storms where there was a high mortality rate, that was sort of the culprit, is individuals were ignoring those warnings. Now, in terms of dissemination and communication, we have 2 warnings here that are, our most important: hurricane warning, which people have heard of, and a storm surge warning, which is a relatively new tool in the toolkit, both of which prompt we turn on cell phones, meaning that results in a cell phone alert or alert going out and disseminated to one's cell phone. Most people are familiar with this. It's sort of similar to, like, you've seen these sort of pop-ups happen on your phone. And so those are the only 2 for which we have permission to disseminate that information via cell phone. So that tells you something right there. That tells you something really, really, really important. If you get one of those 2 warnings, or if you get any message from the Hurricane Center on your phone, that's a pretty big deal. That's a really big deal. And if that happens, we really want you to take action at that moment.
There's your sign, right?
Right. Here's your sign. Yeah.
We saw Hurricane Beryl come a little early this year. Obviously, season starts in June, but normally we get a couple of months where there's nothing too serious. But Beryl certainly was a challenge, and we're still seeing people without power in Texas, even to this day, and that's not a little deal for those people without power. As you look at the Gulf versus the Atlantic and the, hurricane season in general, any observations around strength, predictability, how soon, how late the season might extend?
Well, it's not unusual for us to get a lull in activity in July. This current pause in activity is very normal. Usually you get a couple storms in June, at the start of the season, and it kind of goes quiet for a little while. And then things start to fire back up again, around about the first or second week of August. The way the season has played out thus far is pretty typical. Now, Beryl being the exception, it was atypically strong for early in the season. Usually these handful of systems that you get early on in June are, they tend to be on the weaker end of the spectrum. Beryl was unusually strong. Shattered several records, and we're still sort of unpacking the science of why that happened. You'll see in modern times, people like to go for the easy answer, the easy explanation. And so you see a lot of people say, well, it's global warming. And there's some element of that probably contributed to a portion of Beryl's ascent into an incredibly strong hurricane. But there's other factors too. And so unpacking and coming up with a full and complete story takes a long time. Certainly not the hot takes that you see immediately afterwards. So we'll be looking at that storm in the months to come and do a full assessment sometime early next year. Now, in terms of its impacts on Houston, I think this is a great example of how dependent we have become on power and how the loss of power is in itself a hazard, because it's often incredibly hot and humid after a hurricane. And obviously you need power to produce air conditioning and fans and cool yourself off. So we're seeing this more and more. These storms are having a huge impact on society simply because of the loss of power. We're getting an uptick in what we call indirect deaths or indirect mortality, these are the ones that after the storm has gone. So there's no more weather. The storm is gone, and the strain on the human body, either from heat, heat strokes, heart attacks, injuries during cleanup, or simply the stress of the hazard itself, can bring a person who's medically fragile. They can push them too far. So this is my plug for people, that when you think about hurricane preparedness, you have to go beyond the traditional batteries, flashlights, water. That's sort of the old school bare minimum. You have to think about whether or not you're vulnerable to loss of power. Do you have an elderly parent that is on oxygen? Or do you have someone in your family who is diabetic and needs to keep their insulin cool? You got to think through these nuances and come up with a solution that enables you to be okay if you lose power. In some cases, it's in the Houston area, I think it was about a week, some people were without power. I'm guessing there's still a few residual poor souls that are still without power. How would you survive that? How would you get through that?
Yeah, that's really a good point. Living without power, I know after Andrew, we spent about 3 weeks without power, and that is very, very miserable.
Yeah, and always remember, it's always hot on the outskirts of a hurricane, always. So if a hurricane comes through your community, comes through your area, and you lose power, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it's going to be hot. So just think about that. And a lot of people, fail to understand that heat kills, right? So most people, when they think of hot, they think of inconvenience, sweaty, uncomfortable. I need you to start thinking about heat as a deadly attribute of our atmosphere, that if you don't cool off, think about it. You're cleaning up. You're out in your yard. You're cleaning up. You get hot, and then you go to bed, and you don't cool off. And that's the part that several days of never cooling off at night, your body doesn't recover at all. And it's usually the second, third, or fourth day where the body's inability to recover at night creates these heat strokes and all sorts of complication from heat.
Well, this really makes the warnings and the watches issued by the National Hurricane Center more important as we continue to grow our coastal communities, people moving there, especially as baby boomers continue to retire and move to the coastal areas as well, increasing that population too, and that potentially vulnerable population.
Yeah, and it's also changing the way we evacuate. So you remember this. You can. It used to be that Florida, the entire state of Florida, evacuated if a hurricane was coming. You leave the state. You went to Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, wherever. You went somewhere. Increasingly, that's not needed, and it's not even remotely viable. Right? I don't need you to leave the state. I need you to leave the evacuation zone. Right? We have these things called hurricane evacuation zones. They're preset. You can look it up now, whether you're in one. And for most people, it's a relatively short drive, like minutes, to leave the evacuation zone. You don't need to leave the county or the state. So teaching people to evacuate out of the evacuation zone and no more. The way we attack evacuation in this country have changed dramatically over the last 10 years. And if you haven't experienced a hurricane in the last few years, you really owe it to yourself to sit down and think about the evacuation process.
So true. Very good. I'll actually post the hurricane evacuation zone link as part of our show notes too.
Oh, thank you.
So we've talked about the watches, the warnings, the everything else, but we really haven't talked about, I guess, what y'all are seeing for this season. We still go through November, and I know that there's a forecast to be a very busy season, and we certainly started off with a bang. What can you tell us about 2024, sir?
Well, there's a lot we still don't know about predicting seasonal activities. And unfortunately, the media has broken this down into two factors: the warm ocean and whether or not you're El Nino versus La Nina. And those are two important factors, but they're not the only factors, right? There are other things that are happening at the same time. As of right now, it appears that most of the factors that we use to determine whether a season will be active versus inactive are pointing towards an active season. So my guess is once the calendar turns into August, things are going to start heating up, and it's going to be busy. It's probably going to be really busy. What we can't predict is how many storms and where they will go. So these seasonal forecasts are sort of a bulk prediction for the entire basin. So you could have 20 systems out in the central Atlantic and it would be busy, but if it didn't hit land, people here would be like, what gives? What's going on? Similarly, I could have 2 systems to hit land and that would feel busy. even though it would be an inactive season from this bulk seasonal forecast perspective. And I assure you, if we go ask the people in Houston, Galveston, if they've had a busy hurricane season, every single one of them say it's a busy hurricane season, because what you experience and what you feel, rightfully so, determines how you view the season. And these seasonal forecasts don't handle that at all. And so my advice for people, I know why people are naturally curious. My advice for people is it's quiet right now. It won't be quiet for much longer. I suggest that you use this time wisely to finish off any preparedness activities that you have. If you've procrastinated, Mother Nature has given you a little bit of a reprieve. Take advantage of it and get yourself ready by the start of August.
Wise words, sir. So, Jamie, any personal stories or maybe proof of or validation stories about forecasts and storms that you could share?
Yeah, we've made so many advancements and they've come so quickly. I would say that the nation's hurricane program is one of the greatest examples of science and technology innovation that we've seen. And to prove to you that I'm not just sort of pushing talking points, there have been a couple of recent storms. This is my 25th hurricane season, so I'm kind of a old fart at this point. But there have been a couple storms that the predictability has come so quickly that even I've been caught by surprise. Like, wow, our ability to predict rapid intensification, those are the ones that kind of go from little or nothing to a major hurricane in like seemingly a few hours. We used to never be able to communicate that at all. And now you're seeing in Hurricane Ian, there was a strong message coming out of the Hurricane Center about rapid intensification. Look at Dorian. Dorian parked itself off the coast of Florida so close that I could see the Cirrus canopy when I drove into work. As a Category 5 hurricane, in Miami-Dade and Broward County issued no evacuation order, and Palm Beach issued a very tiny sliver of an evacuation. That is unheard of. That is unheard of. If you know anything about hurricanes in Florida and evacuation, that shocked us all. And so I went and talked to some of the officials who have to make that decision. We don't make the evacuation decision here, but I went and talked to them and I said, why didn't you order an evacuation? Help me understand. And one of them looked at me puzzled and said, because you said no storm surge. And it just dawned, it was like an epiphany, right then and there, that the improvements in forecasts and communications that we've talked about during the earlier parts of the show are really manifesting itself into societal benefit. My take-home message is, please trust the forecast, trust what your local officials are asking you to do, because it's based off really, really good science.
Well, I was going to ask you if you had any final words. That sounds like some really good final word. Anything I guess you'd like to add?
Building on your prior question about personal stories and my message of preparedness, we practice what we preach here at Hurricane Center. I have 2 generators, both of which have been tested and exercised this season. And then I have 2 backup air conditioners that if I can't turn on my regular air conditioner, I'm able to still produce cool air, for my family and keep my family safe. And again, think about what can you be safe without power? And if not, your choices are to safely generate power. Now, I emphasize safely generate power. A lot of people don't understand generators are dangerous. Safely generate power, or relocate yourself or your family somewhere that has power. Think about how to weather the loss of power, because it's no longer just an inconvenience. For some people, it can quickly become life-threatening, especially if they're medically sensitive.
So, Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today on Weather Heroes. The National Hurricane Center is a place that I admire and respect, and you certainly are a very good representative for them, sir.
Well, thank you for helping us get the word out for people as we approach the peak of hurricane season.